The drizzle had turned into a relentless downpour, leaving the alley empty and secure under the faint glow of a distant street lamp. A single father, Michael, held his young daughter close, his other hand struggling to keep a tattered umbrella over them. It was then that he spotted her, a woman lying unconscious near the curb, her form almost lost in the shadows. Her breathing was shallow, and angry red marks chafed her wrists, stark against her pale skin. He knelt, his own hands trembling as he gently shook her shoulder, calling out a soft, "Ma'am." Her eyes fluttered open for a moment before closing again, a faint whisper escaping her lips, lost in the sound of the rain. The acrid metallic scent of blood hung in the air, mingling with the earthy smell of the wet pavement. He made the decision to carry her home, thinking it was a simple act of kindness. But then he noticed the shoe that had fallen from her foot, a designer high heel with the discreet logo of a luxury corporation he'd only ever heard about in hushed news reports about financial scandals. A question lodged itself in his mind. Why would a woman who could afford such shoes be lying here, broken and silenced by the storm, in a place only the forgotten ever seemed to find? The scent of freshly cut pine and industrial solvent clung to Michael's clothes, a familiar perfume that signaled the end of another 12-hour shift at the lumberyard. Every muscle in his back and shoulders ached with a deep, satisfying soreness, the kind that reminded him he had earned his day's pay. He moved through the motions of clocking out with the practiced ease of a man who understood routine better than anything else. His life was a series of repeating patterns, a steady rhythm he had carefully constructed around the one thing that mattered, his 6-year-old daughter, Lily. Each swing of the hammer, each heavy lift, was a note in the quiet song of their survival, a song he hummed to himself on the long walk to Mrs. Gable's small, cluttered house, where Lily spent her afternoons. He found her sitting at the old woman's kitchen table, a half-finished drawing of a lopsided castle in front of her, a milk mustache gracing her upper lip. Her face lit up the moment she saw him, a pure, uncomplicated joy that washed away his exhaustion. "Daddy!" she cried, scrambling from her chair and running into his arms. He lifted her effortlessly, burying his face in her hair, which smelled faintly of crayons and cinnamon cookies. This was his reward, the anchor that kept his world steady. After a polite exchange with Mrs. Gable and pressing a few crumpled bills into her hand for the week, they began their walk home. It was a ritual Michael cherished, Lily's small hand tucked firmly in his, her chatter filling the space between them with stories about squirrels, clouds, and the injustices of nap time. The sky, which had been a placid gray all afternoon, began to weep. A light drizzle quickly thickened into a steady, determined downpour. Michael pulled the hood of Lily's small raincoat over her head and unfurled his old, patched umbrella, its metal ribs groaning in protest. The streets grew quiet as people scurried for cover, leaving the sidewalks slick and reflective under the jaundiced glow of the street lamps. To save a few minutes, he took their usual shortcut through a narrow alley that connected the older residential blocks. The brick walls on either side were dark with moisture, channeling the wind into a mournful sigh. It was a forgotten little passage, a place most people avoided, but for Michael, it was simply the fastest way home. It was Lily who saw her first. She tugged on his sleeve, her voice small against the drumming of the rain. "Daddy, that lady is sleeping." Michael's gaze followed his daughter's pointing finger. There, slumped against the wet brick wall near a collection of overflowing trash cans, was a figure. His first instinct was a jolt of protective fear. He pulled Lily behind him, his body tensing. This part of town wasn't dangerous, not usually, but trouble was a shadow that could fall anywhere. He hesitated, every nerve telling him to turn around, to take the long way, to keep his daughter safe from a world he knew could be cruel. But the woman wasn't moving. She was utterly still, her dark hair plastered to her face, her clothes soaked through. He edged closer, telling Lily to stay put under the flimsy shelter of the umbrella. As he drew near, the details sharpened into a horrifying picture. This wasn't someone sleeping. Her breathing was a shallow, almost imperceptible flutter. He knelt, the cold dampness of the pavement seeping through his jeans. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice rough. He reached out a hesitant hand and touched her shoulder. Her skin was icy cold. He saw the marks then, dark and brutally clear against her pale wrists. They were raw and red, the unmistakable chafe of restraints. A wave of cold dread washed over him. A mugging, he thought instantly, or something worse, a kidnapping. Someone had hurt her and left her here. It was the only explanation that made sense, a simple, violent narrative that his mind could grasp. He scanned the alley, his heart pounding, but it was empty. The rain was washing away any evidence, any footprints, any clue as to who had done this. He looked at her face, which was elegant even when bruised and unconscious. A faint, almost inaudible sound escaped her lips, a whisper swallowed by the storm before he could make out a single word. He felt for a pulse at her neck. It was there, faint but steady. Relief, sharp and immediate, coursed through him. He couldn't leave her here. Calling the police felt like the right thing to do, yet a seed of doubt stopped him. It would mean questions, reports, getting tangled in a mess that could disrupt the fragile peace of his and Lily's life. What if they thought he was involved? Fear, a familiar companion for a man with everything to lose, made his choice for him. The most important thing was getting her out of the cold. Gathering all his strength, he carefully lifted the woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a dead weight that spoke of utter exhaustion. He guided a wide-eyed Lily with his free hand, murmuring reassurances he didn't feel himself. The short walk to his apartment building felt like a mile. He fumbled with the keys, finally managing to get the door open and stepping into the warmth and safety of his home. He laid the woman gently on his worn but clean sofa, her head resting on a faded throw pillow. It was then, as he straightened up, that one of her shoes, a sleek black high heel, slipped from her foot and fell to the floor with a soft thud. He picked it up, intending to place it beside her. But as his fingers closed around it, he noticed the small silver logo embedded in the leather. It was the emblem of a massive tech corporation, a name he'd seen in headlines about stock market surges and bitter corporate takeovers. The shoe felt alien in his calloused hand, a piece of a world so far removed from his own, it might as well have been from another planet. The simple narrative of a mugging gone wrong began to fray at the edges, replaced by a quiet, unsettling confusion. For now, he pushed the thought away. His focus narrowed to the unconscious woman breathing softly in his living room, a silent, dangerous secret he had just carried across his threshold. Of course, Michael did not sleep. He spent the night in the worn armchair across from the sofa, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of the stranger's chest. The rain eventually softened, replaced by an unnerving quiet that seemed to amplify every creak of the old building. The world outside his window slowly bled from black to a soft, bruised purple. And still he watched. He was a sentinel in his own home, guarding his sleeping daughter from a mystery he had willingly carried inside. Every so often, his eyes would drift to the expensive black heels he had placed neatly by the door. They looked absurdly out of place on his worn linoleum floor, like a pair of sleek predators that had wandered into a farmer's field. They were a testament to the chasm between his life and hers, a gap he couldn't begin to comprehend. She stirred as the first real rays of dawn streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the small living room. A soft groan escaped her lips, and her eyes fluttered open. For a moment they held only a deep, swimming confusion. Then, as she took in the unfamiliar ceiling, the faded wallpaper, and finally, the man watching her, a sharp, primal fear took over. She pushed herself up with a wince, her gaze darting around the room, searching for an escape route. Michael held up his hands slowly, palms open, a universal sign of peace. "It's okay," he said, his voice low and calm, not wanting to wake Lily. "You're safe. I found you in the alley last night. You were unconscious. I brought you here to get you out of the rain." Her fear did not immediately subside. It lingered in the taut line of her shoulders and the guarded expression that settled over her features. She tentatively touched the back of her head, her fingers exploring a tender spot. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, scanned his face, searching for a hint of deception. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice raspy. He explained his name was Michael and that this was his apartment. He offered her a glass of water, which she accepted, her hands trembling slightly as she took it. He watched as she took a slow sip, the silence stretching between them. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but he held back, sensing her fragility. He had to know what happened, if only to understand the nature of the danger he might have brought near his daughter. After a long pause, he finally asked, "What happened to you?" She looked down at her hands, avoiding his eyes. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, laced with a carefully constructed shame. "My husband," she began, the lie forming smoothly. "We had a fight. It got bad. I finally decided to leave. I packed nothing. I just ran. He found me. He has a terrible temper." She gestured vaguely to the marks on her wrists. "He dragged me into that alley. I think I hit my head when I fell." She looked up at him, her eyes welling with tears that seemed genuine in their terror. "Please," she whispered, "you can't call the police. He's a well-respected man. No one would believe me. He'll find me." She told him her name was Sarah, a name as plain and simple as the story she was weaving. A wave of sympathy washed over Michael, overriding the faint dissonance caused by the designer shoes. The story made a terrible kind of sense. It explained the fear, the bruises, the desperation to remain hidden. It was a common, ugly secret, the kind that happened behind closed doors in any neighborhood, rich or poor. He felt a surge of protectiveness, the same instinct that drove him to work 12-hour shifts for his daughter. He assured her that her secret was safe with him, that she could stay until she figured out what to do next. Just then, the door to the bedroom creaked open, and Lily appeared, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, her favorite stuffed bear clutched in one hand. She stopped short, her eyes wide as she saw the strange woman on their sofa. The effect on Sarah was immediate. The tension in her shoulders eased, and the hard, frightened mask on her face softened into something gentler. "Hello there," she said softly, her voice losing its ragged edge. Lily, usually shy around strangers, seemed to feel no threat. She walked slowly toward the sofa and simply stared. "You have a boo-boo," Lily said, pointing to a faint bruise on the woman's cheek. The woman managed a small, sad smile. "Yes, I do." Throughout the morning, a quiet, cautious rapport grew between the two. The woman listened with rapt attention as Lily explained the very serious business of her drawings, her hardened exterior melting away in the presence of the child's innocence. Seeing her like this, so gentle and attentive, solidified Michael's belief in her story. He was just a decent man, helping a woman in need. Later, while the woman rested on the couch, wrapped in his warmest blanket, Michael took her still damp coat to hang it over the shower rod to dry properly. As he lifted it, something small and white fell from the inner pocket and fluttered to the floor. He picked it up. It was a small, neatly folded piece of paper. His conscience told him to put it back, that it was an invasion of her privacy. But his unease, the nagging feeling that began with the sight of her expensive shoes, won out. He carefully unfolded it. It wasn't a note or a phone number. It was a long, single line of digits, formatted like a bank account number, an offshore account, if he had to guess from the prefix. It was a jarring piece of evidence that didn't fit with the narrative of a terrified wife who had fled with nothing. He quickly folded it and slipped it back into the pocket, his mind racing. That afternoon, he turned on the small television in the corner for the local news, keeping the volume low. He was only half watching, his thoughts consumed by the stranger in his house, when a special report interrupted the broadcast. "We have breaking news tonight concerning the sudden disappearance of Eleanor Vance, the celebrated CEO of the multi-billion-dollar corporation Vance Technologies," the newscaster announced gravely. An official corporate photo appeared on the screen. It was a picture of a confident, powerful-looking woman with piercing blue eyes and dark hair, styled in a severe, elegant cut. Michael's blood ran cold. He froze, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten in his hand. He looked from the commanding face on the screen to the sleeping woman on his sofa. It was her, there was no doubt. The woman he knew as Sarah, the battered wife, was one of the most powerful executives in the country. Her story was a lie, and the red marks on her wrists suddenly seemed infinitely more sinister than a domestic dispute. He was no longer just helping a victim. He was hiding a public figure whose disappearance was national news, and he was completely, terrifyingly in over his head. Absolutely. The face on the television screen was a ghost haunting the woman on his sofa. For a long, silent minute after the news report ended, Michael didn't move. He stood frozen in the middle of his own living room, the air thick with the unspoken truth. The world suddenly felt thin and fragile, like a sheet of ice about to crack beneath his feet. Every detail of the past 24 hours replayed in his mind, now cast in a sinister new light. The story of Sarah and her abusive husband, a story he had so readily accepted, dissolved into an elaborate and terrifying deception. He was not harboring a victim of domestic violence. He was hiding a corporate queen, a woman whose face was being broadcast into millions of homes. The danger he had feared was no longer a vague, shadowy threat. It had a name and a face, and it was sleeping on his couch. His first rational thought was to call the number displayed on the screen, a tip line for information. It was the sensible, lawful thing to do. He could end this right now, remove this woman and the chaos she represented from his home, and return to the simple, predictable rhythm of his life. He could protect Lily. But he hesitated, his hand hovering over the phone. He thought of the raw, desperate fear in her eyes when she'd begged him not to call the police. Was that part of the lie, or two? Or was her fear real, just aimed at a different, more powerful monster than an abusive husband? He remembered the way her entire demeanor had softened in Lily's presence, a warmth that felt too genuine to be an act. He was caught between two conflicting realities, the helpless woman he had rescued and the powerful CEO on the news. He needed to be certain. While she continued to rest, her sleep appearing more like a state of deep exhaustion than peace, he moved quietly around the small apartment, re-examining the evidence. He picked up the black high heel again. The silver logo of Vance Technologies seemed to mock him. It was the first, most tangible link, the payoff, for the doubt that had been planted the night before. This shoe wasn't just a sign of wealth. It was her signature, a direct connection to the empire mentioned in the broadcast. He then thought of the piece of paper in her coat pocket. The long string of numbers. An account number. It made no sense for a woman on the run with nothing, but for a CEO orchestrating a disappearance. It fit perfectly. The clues were no longer scattered and random. They were pieces of a puzzle, and the image they were forming was one of high-stakes corporate intrigue, far beyond his comprehension. He waited until Lily was in her room, occupied with her coloring books, the door slightly ajar. He couldn't have this conversation in front of her. He walked over to the sofa and gently shook the woman's shoulder. She woke with a start, her blue eyes immediately filled with the familiar, hunted look. Before she could say a word, he spoke, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging inside him. "I saw the news," he said simply. He watched as the color drained from her face. The mask of Sarah didn't just crack, it disintegrated completely, leaving behind a woman who looked cornered, exposed, and utterly exhausted. There was no denial, no attempt at another lie. There was only a heavy, defeated silence. "They're looking for you, Eleanor," he said, the name feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. She flinched, as if the name itself were a blow. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around herself like a shield. Her gaze dropped to the floor, her voice a strained whisper. "You were supposed to be a stranger. This wasn't supposed to happen." The admission hung in the air, confirming everything. The dynamic between them shifted in an instant. He was no longer her compassionate savior. He was her warden, the only person in the world who knew where she was. The power, which had seemed so clearly in his court, suddenly felt like a crushing weight. He had the knowledge, but she held the secrets. "You lied to me," he stated, the accusation flat and devoid of emotion. "Why?" Eleanor finally looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something beyond fear in her eyes. It was a profound weariness, the look of someone who had been running for a very long time. "I needed you to see a victim," she said, her voice raw with an honesty she hadn't shown before. "Not a CEO, not someone you'd read about in the news. I needed someone who wouldn't ask questions, who would just help. If you knew who I was, you would have called the police immediately." She was right, and the cold logic of her manipulation unsettled him more than the lie itself. It was a calculated move, the kind a powerful executive would make. He pressed on, needing to understand the scope of the danger he was now facing. "What's going on, Eleanor? Why are you hiding? What happened in that alley?" He expected another evasion, a partial truth. Instead, a tremor of genuine terror ran through her. Her composure, so carefully rebuilt, shattered again. She wrapped her arms around herself, her voice dropping so low he had to lean in to hear it. "You don't understand," she whispered, her words frantic and desperate. "It wasn't a mugging. They left me there. They wanted me gone, but quietly." He felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Who is they?" he asked. She shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "If you call the police, you'll be signing my death warrant. You and your daughter could get caught in the crossfire. You have to believe me." "If they find me," she choked out, her gaze locking with his, "they'll destroy me. Not just my career. Me." The words hung in the air, a new, terrifying plant taking root in the foundation of his reality. This was not about a corporate scandal or a missing person. The way she said it implied something far more final. Her warning had the desired effect. The thought of Lily getting hurt extinguished any remaining intention he had of contacting the authorities. He was trapped. He was an unwilling participant in a conspiracy he couldn't begin to fathom. He looked at this woman, this powerful hunted CEO, and realized he was in an impossible position. He couldn't trust her, but he couldn't betray her either, not without risking everything he held dear. The quiet, predictable life he had fought so hard to build was gone, replaced by a silent, deadly game whose rules he did not know. The fragile truce in the apartment was built on a foundation of shared fear. Michael moved through his daily routines, making breakfast for Lily, tidying their small space with a heavy, mechanical precision. But underneath, his mind was a storm of calculation and risk assessment. He was acutely aware of Eleanor, who remained mostly on the sofa, a silent, coiled spring of tension. The dynamic had shifted from host and victim to that of a reluctant conspirator and a high-profile fugitive. The silence was only broken by Lily's innocent chatter, a sound that both soothed Michael's frayed nerves and reminded him of exactly what was at stake. He knew this limbo could not last. Her vague warnings were no longer enough. He needed facts, a map of the danger she had brought into his home. He waited until Lily was engrossed in a cartoon, then sat in the armchair opposite Eleanor, his posture rigid. "I need you to tell me everything," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "No more lies, no more half-truths. You told me they would destroy you. Who are they, and what did you do to make them want you gone?" Eleanor studied his face, likely gauging how much she could afford to reveal. After a long moment, she seemed to decide that her survival now depended on his trust. She began to speak, her voice low and urgent, painting a picture of the rot that had grown in the heart of her own company. It was, at its core, a simple story of greed, a sophisticated embezzlement scheme run by several high-ranking members of her own board of directors, siphoning millions of dollars into offshore accounts. She explained that she had been insulated from the day-to-day financial minutiae, her focus always on innovation and long-term strategy. But she'd noticed discrepancies, small red flags that a less obsessive leader might have missed. When she started her own quiet investigation, she uncovered the truth. "It's my chief financial officer, Robert Sterling, and 2 others on the board," she said, naming the names for the first time. "They've been bleeding the company dry for years. When they realized I was onto them, they needed to get rid of me. They couldn't just fire me. I still hold a controlling interest. So they planned to neutralize me, to make me disappear, and frame it as a breakdown. Or better yet, make me the scapegoat for their own crimes." As she spoke, Michael felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected, a grudging respect. He saw the sharp, analytical mind that had built an epure. But then she revealed a detail that brought his suspicion roaring back to life. "They're using my own history against me," she admitted, her gaze faltering for the first time. "Early in my career, about 10 years ago, I signed off on an acquisition. The financials were creative. It was a gray area, a move I made to save the company from a hostile takeover. It was aggressive, but not illegal. Robert, my CFO, is the only one who knows the intimate details of that deal. He plans to twist it, to leak documents that make it look like I've been cooking the books for a decade. He's creating a narrative that I'm the criminal who finally fled when the walls started closing in." The confession hung in the air, a new red herring that muddied the waters of her victimhood. Michael heard the careful phrasing, the self-justification. Creative financials, a gray area. These were the words of someone comfortable with bending the rules. Was she an innocent whistleblower who had made a single youthful mistake, or was she a player who had simply been outplayed by her own team? The line between right and wrong suddenly seemed blurry and indistinct. This realization thrust him into the heart of his dilemma. If he helped her, he wasn't just saving a victim. He might be aiding a different kind of predator, someone whose moral compass was as questionable as her enemies. But if he threw her out, he'd be feeding her to the wolves, an act his conscience couldn't easily bear. His silence stretched on as he wrestled with the choice, the profound, immediate duty to protect his daughter versus the complicated, dangerous impulse to see justice done. Eleanor must have sensed his hesitation, his internal retreat. She saw her precarious safety net slipping away. "I can prove it," she said, her voice sharp with desperation. "I can prove everything." They didn't get it all. They searched my office, my home, my car, but they didn't find it. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "When I knew they were coming for me, I made a copy of the real ledgers, the offshore transfer records, everything. It's all on a single drive." Michael stared at her, uncomprehending. "A drive? Where is it?" She took a deep breath. "When you found me, my coat. It's sewn into the lining of my raincoat. The raincoat he had so carefully hung to dry in his own bathroom. The proof was here, in his house." The conspiracy was no longer a story she was telling. It was a physical object, a tiny piece of plastic and metal hidden within arm's reach. The weight of this knowledge was immediate and crushing. He was now the guardian of the evidence. He stood up and walked into the small bathroom, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He ran his hand along the inside of the damp coat's hem until his fingers brushed against a small, hard rectangle, no bigger than his thumb. He felt its sharp edges through the thin fabric. It was real. It was all real. He gripped the material, the tiny device feeling as heavy and as dangerous as a loaded gun. The choice was no longer a theoretical moral debate. It was a tangible object in his hands, and whatever he did next, there was no going back. The air in the small apartment crackled with a new, frantic energy. With Lily safely asleep in her room, the world shrank to the dimensions of Michael's small kitchen table, where his old, slow laptop became the center of their universe. Eleanor directed him with hushed, urgent instructions. He used a small, sharp knife from his utility drawer to carefully slice the stitches in the hem of her raincoat. The operation felt clandestine and dangerous, the simple act of revealing the hidden USB drive feeling like the disarming of a bomb. The drive itself was tiny, a sliver of black plastic that seemed too small to hold the secrets of an empire. He plugged it into the laptop's port, and the aging machine whirred to life, its fan spinning with a pathetic, strained effort that mirrored Michael's own ragged breathing. "It's encrypted," Eleanor stated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "The password is my father's birthday. Backwards." She typed in a string of 8 digits, and a dialog box disappeared, revealing a single densely packed folder. The moment felt anticlimactic. There were no neatly labeled documents titled Evidence or Proof. Instead, there were dozens of files with alphanumeric names, spreadsheets, and scanned signature pages. It was a chaotic digital ledger, meaningless to an outsider. Michael leaned in, his eyes scanning the screen as Eleanor navigated the data with a practiced, desperate speed. Her finger tapped the screen. "Here, these are the outgoing transfers. Starting 2 years ago." He saw them. Line after line of staggering numbers, millions of dollars flowing out of Vance Technologies and into a holding company he'd never heard of. Then, from that company, the money was routed again. Eleanor's face was illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen, her expression grim. "Now look at the final destination account for every transfer." She clicked open another file, a single line of text filling the screen. Michael felt the air leave his lungs. It was the number, the exact same string of digits from the folded piece of paper he had found in her pocket. It was the pure payoff. To a clue he hadn't even understood he held. This was the nexus of the entire conspiracy. "And the authorizations," she whispered, her voice trailing off as she opened the final documents. Every single transfer, every fraudulent transaction, bore the same digital signature, the same undeniable authorization. Eleanor Vance. A cold, sickening wave of betrayal washed over Michael. It was more intense and more painful than he could have imagined. This wasn't evidence against her enemies. This was her confession. The USB drive was her insurance policy, but not to prove her innocence. It was a detailed logbook of her own crimes. His mind reeled, reframing every moment since he found her. The lies, the fear, the gentleness with Lily. It was all a masterful performance. He had been played, used by a master manipulator who saw him as nothing more than a temporary hiding place. He had risked his daughter's life for a common thief in a designer suit. The quiet sympathy he'd felt for her curdled into a hot, bitter rage. "Get out," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Eleanor looked up from the screen, her face a mask of confusion. "What?" "Get out," he repeated, shoving his chair back from the table with a loud scrape that made him cringe, hoping it hadn't woken Lily. "Now! I'm not going to be an accessory to this. I saved you. I listened to your stories. And this whole time, it was you." The accusation, raw and venomous, struck her with physical force. "No," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Michael, you don't understand. It's not what it looks like." But he was beyond listening. He saw only the data, the irrefutable proof on the screen. He saw the end of his quiet life, replaced by police interrogations and news vans parked outside his building. As he moved to grab her coat, ready to physically throw her out into the night, she finally broke. A gut-wrenching sob escaped her, a sound of such profound despair it stopped him in his tracks. "It is what it looks like," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I did it. I authorized every single dollar. I built the framework for the offshore accounts. It was all me. But I didn't have a choice." Her confession, screamed in a whisper, made no sense. He stared at her, his anger momentarily eclipsed by sheer confusion. It was then that the final, most terrible secret came tumbling out. A story of betrayal so deep it seemed to suck the very air from the room. The true architect of the scheme wasn't a shadowy cabal of board members. It was one person he had never considered. "It was my brother," she choked out, the name seeming to tear at her throat. "My younger brother, Julian." She explained that after their parents died, she had raised him. She had given him a position on the board, trusted him implicitly, loved him more than anyone. Julian, the charming, brilliant boy she adored, had been the mastermind. He had presented the scheme to her as a complex but necessary strategy to protect assets, using her old, questionable acquisition deal as leverage to ensure her silence if she ever had doubts. He had exploited her trust, her credentials, and her love for their family's company to build his criminal enterprise. When she finally uncovered the truth and confronted him, he didn't threaten her with violence. He threatened to burn everything to the ground and pin it all on her. The men in the alley, the ones who had left her for dead, were on his payroll. He had ordered his own sister's execution. The revelation was a stunning, sickening reversal. The entire narrative of the last few days was rewritten in an instant. Michael looked at the screen, then back at Eleanor's tear-streaked face. He wasn't looking at a ruthless criminal anymore. He was looking at a woman who had been betrayed by the one person she thought she could trust, a sister whose love had been weaponized against her. The enemy wasn't a faceless corporation. It was family. The goal was no longer just survival. It was about confronting a betrayal that was deeper and more personal than he could ever have imagined. The revelation of Julian's betrayal did not bring despair. It brought a cold, terrifying clarity. The dynamic in the apartment transformed overnight. They were no longer a fugitive and her reluctant keeper, but a two-person insurgency with a single, clear objective: expose the truth. The question was how. They were trapped in a small apartment with a laptop and a single piece of evidence against a man who controlled a billion-dollar corporation and had already tried to have his own sister killed. For 2 days, they barely slept, fueled by cheap coffee and a desperate, shared resolve. Eleanor, using Michael's laptop, became a phantom in the machine, accessing old networks and exploiting backdoors she herself had designed years ago, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a terrifying speed. Their opening came sooner than they expected. Vance Technologies, under immense pressure from the market and the media, scheduled an emergency press conference. The topic: to address the ongoing investigation into the disappearance of CEO Eleanor Vance and to assure shareholders of the company's stability. The keynote speaker, the man who would step onto the stage to project calm and control, would be the acting CEO, Julian Vance. "This is it," Eleanor said, her voice grim, her eyes fixed on the press release she had pulled up on the screen. "This is our only shot. We can't go to the police, but we can go to the court of public opinion. We can't let him control the narrative." The plan they devised was both audacious and deceptively simple. Eleanor knew the architectural and network blueprints of the Vance Tower by heart. The press conference would be in the main auditorium, a state-of-the-art theater. All the audiovisuals were routed through a central server room on the floor below. But she also knew of a redundant network access panel, an almost forgotten relic from an older system, located in a small maintenance closet on the same floor as the auditorium, just 50 feet from the stage. No one would be guarding it. It was beneath notice. Michael's job would be to get into that closet, plug in the drive, and, with her guiding him over the phone, execute a single command that would hijack every screen in the room. The morning of the press conference, Michael felt a tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with fatigue. Leaving Lily with Mrs. Gable was the hardest part. He hugged her tightly, the familiar scent of her hair a painful reminder of what he stood to lose. He dressed in the clothes of his trade, worn work boots, durable canvas pants, and a generic blue work shirt, a stark contrast to the sleek corporate world he was about to enter. He was anonymous, a ghost in the city's machine. He walked through the towering glass doors of the Vance Tower, a tool bag slung over his shoulder, and no one gave him a second glance. He was just a worker, part of the building's invisible infrastructure. With Eleanor's voice a steady, low whisper in his ear through a small Bluetooth earpiece, he navigated the pristine, echoing halls. "Take the service elevator in the west corridor. Go to the 3rd floor. The closet is marked 301B. Each step was a lifetime. Every passing employee in a sharp suit felt like a threat. He found the closet, the door unlocked as she had predicted. He slipped inside, his heart hammering against his ribs. The closet was small, smelling of dust and disinfectant, filled with janitorial supplies. On the back wall was the small gray panel. He pried it open. Inside was a tangle of wires and a single waiting USB port. "Okay, I'm in," he whispered into his phone's microphone. "Julian is walking to the podium now." Eleanor's voice crackled back, the tension making her words sharp. "We have maybe 2 minutes. Plug it in." He inserted the drive. On his phone, Eleanor had sent him a simple interface she'd built, with one large red button on the screen. "Don't touch it yet. I need to bypass the security protocols. Wait for my signal." On the screens in the auditorium, Julian's face appeared, magnified 20 feet high. He looked solemn, his expression a perfect portrait of a grieving, dutiful brother. He began to speak, his voice smooth and reassuring, expressing his deep concern for his missing sister. "My sister Eleanor was the heart of this company," Julian said, his voice resonating with false emotion. Michael could hear the speech faintly through the closet door. The words were a vile perversion of the truth, and he felt a surge of adrenaline. "While the authorities continue their investigation, I want to assure everyone that the board and I are—" "Now, Michael, hit it now," Eleanor commanded in his ear. Michael's thumb jabbed the red button on his phone's screen. For a second, nothing happened. Then, on the massive screens behind Julian, his corporate presentation vanished. It was replaced by the cold, hard data from the USB drive, the spreadsheets, the account numbers, the undeniable flow of millions of dollars into a single offshore account. A wave of confusion rippled through the audience. Julian faltered, turning to see what was happening, his face contorting in shock and disbelief. And then, the final devastating blow. Eleanor had embedded an audio file. It was a recording of their last conversation, the one where she had confronted him. His voice, stripped of its public charm, filled the auditorium, cold, clear, and utterly damning. "You built this company, Ellie." The recording of Julian's voice sneered. "But you don't have the stomach to protect it. I do. You will do as you're told, or I will bury you under the weight of your own legacy." Chaos erupted. The frantic clicking of cameras sounded like machine gun fire. Reporters were shouting, standing on their chairs. Julian stood frozen, his face pale, exposed and ruined in the glare of 1,000 flashing lights. In that moment, Michael finally understood Eleanor's whispered words from that first night. When she said, "They'll destroy me," he realized it was a shield. The truth was far more painful, a secret too terrible to confess to a stranger. It was never they, it was he. He pulled the drive, closed the panel, and slipped out of the closet amidst the pandemonium. He walked calmly out of the building, melting back into the river of anonymous faces on the street, the sound of approaching sirens, a triumphant symphony in the distance. In the weeks that followed, the storm of the Vance Technologies scandal raged in the news, and then, as all storms do, it slowly began to pass. Michael watched the reports on his small television like a distant observer, seeing the faces of Julian Vance and Robert Sterling, pale and unmasked, as they were led away in handcuffs. The stories spoke of corporate restructuring, of interim boards, and of a company trying to cleanse itself of a deep-seated rot. For Michael, it all felt like a story happening in another world, completely detached from the quiet, rhythmic life he had so carefully reclaimed. He went back to the lumberyard, the scent of pine and sawdust a comforting balm. He picked Lily up from Mrs. Gable's house each evening, her joyful chatter once again the only soundtrack he needed. The quiet had returned. Eleanor visited him one last time on a cool, overcast afternoon. She looked different, transformed. The haunted, hunted expression was gone, replaced by a quiet strength and a profound sense of peace. She was no longer wearing the severe corporate armor he had seen in her official photograph, but a simple sweater and jeans. They sat at his small kitchen table, the silence between them comfortable now, forged in the crucible of shared crisis. She told him that she was stepping away from the company for good, leaving it in the hands of a new board she had personally vetted. She was going to travel, to heal, to rediscover the person she was before the betrayals and the boardrooms had reshaped her. Then, she slid a long, white envelope across the table. Inside, he could see a cashier's check with a staggering number of zeros written on the pay line. It was enough money to change his life, and Lily's life, 12 times over. "I can never repay you, Michael," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she no longer tried to hide. "But this is a start. For your risk, for your kindness, for everything." Michael looked at the check, at the number that represented an end to all his financial struggles. He thought of a new apartment, of better schools, of a life without the constant, grinding worry. He then pushed the envelope gently back across the table toward her. "I can't take this," he said simply. Eleanor looked at him, confused. "But why? You've earned it." He shook his head, a small, sad smile on his face. "I didn't do it for money, Eleanor. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I did it because you were a person who needed help, and I couldn't just walk away." He looked toward his daughter's room, where he could hear her humming softly. "My reward," he continued, his voice quiet, "is that she is safe. My reward is that when I lie down at night, my conscience is clear. That's worth more than any amount of money." In that moment, the last barrier between them fell away, leaving only a profound, unspoken respect. He had refused her fortune, but had accepted something far more valuable, her friendship. Before she left, Eleanor handed him a small, brightly wrapped box. "This isn't for you," she said with a genuine smile. "It's for Lily." Later that evening, after Eleanor was gone, Lily carefully unwrapped the gift. Inside was not a toy or a doll, but a pair of bright yellow rain boots, sturdy and shining, and perfectly her size. The sight of them sent a jolt through Michael's memory. The story that had begun in a downpour, with a single useless designer high heel lying broken in a dark alley, had now come full circle. It was ending with these boots, a symbol not of wealth or power, but of a child's simple, protected joy. A few days later, a gentle rain began to fall. Lily, squealing with delight, pulled on her new boots and ran outside into the courtyard of their apartment building. Michael stood at the window and watched her, a solitary man who had faced down an empire. He watched his daughter splash gleefully in the puddles, the vibrant yellow of her boots a beacon of light in the gray afternoon. The rain was no longer a harbinger of danger or a cloak for dark secrets. It was just rain, washing the world clean. And in the quiet peace of that moment, Michael knew that he had everything he would ever need.